Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Fairness and struggle today. As the Israeli moratorium on West Bank building ends, we're going to be hearing from the filmmaker Ronit Avni about attempts at peaceful, non-violent resistance by Palestinian villagers and their Jewish allies. But most of today's programme is domestic. As Ed Miliband prepares for his first big speech as Labour leader, lots of talk about the fairness agenda, the prospects for union militancy and the wickedness of high finance. Well, Billy Ivory's new film, Made in Dagenham, is about the 1968 strike by women workers at the huge Ford plant there, which led, of course, to the equal pay laws. Lars Kroijers, a former hedge fund manager who has written a cracking book about what it's really like inside the industry people love to hate but mostly don't understand at all. We're going to start, though, with a man both the Coalition and Labour have gone to for his ideas about fairness and equality, Will Hutton, whose new book is called Them and Us. At the heart of this book, Will, is the proposition that fairness, rather than the more traditional word, equality, should be centred as for our thinking about pay and indeed about power. Why fairness rather than equality?
I think fairness is a bigger idea than equality. I mean, equality, of course, within the idea of fairness, you can have egalitarians who consider themselves fair, and you have libertarians who consider themselves to be fair. So, fairness kind of embraces both. The heart of fairness is an idea of proportionality. It's a relationship that we all carry between what we intend and what the outcome is. If we hold good intentions and there are good outcomes, everyone thinks that we should get our due deserts. If we have bad intentions which produce malevolent outcomes, everyone thinks we should also get our due deserts. In all societies, there's a scales calibrate a tariff of punishment and reward for good and bad things. And fairness tries to capture this. It also is bigger than equality in this important respect. Luck has an enormous effect on all our lives, good and bad luck. It's just there. And if you're thinking hard about fairness, we want to share people's good luck, and we want to compensate them for their bad luck. So there's an egalitarian view of fairness, there's a libertarian view of fairness, but that's the heart of my thinking of fairness.
When it comes to luck in different ways, the luck to be enormously athletic, or the luck to have fantastic good looks, or indeed the luck to have wonderful fluency in mathematics or a language, all kinds of luck which can lead you to be a better remunerated, more successful person in life. Should that luck be sort of compensated against? In other words, should you pay a penalty for that kind of luck?
No, you shouldn't pay a penalty for it. It's fair enough that you have got those advantages. And it's particularly fair if you've worked on them to turn yourself into a great athlete or a great mathematician. And we all consider that the rewards that people get for having worked hard on their talents is success. That's fair. That's fair enough. But to a degree, that they should pay into the common pool to help compensate for people who've had in their lives bad luck. In the book, I talk about inheritance tax, where you've done nothing you've just come out, you're just the fruit of your parents' loins, and there you are, a baby. You've done nothing to deserve the money that comes from being born to a very rich family. And rather than call inheritance tax a death tax, I call it we share in your good luck tax.
It's quite a long name, but I get the picture.
And equally, the National Health Service, to a degree, is we share in your bad luck. I mean, people around this table, people listening to this, they don't know where they're going to draw from the gene pool things that are going to make them extraordinarily ill. And of course, it's a matter of fairness that we should compensate people for that bad luck.
How do you begin to apply these kind of ideas to the dilemmas of the real world? For instance, a great discussion at the moment, you're looking at the public sector as to whether, I suppose, television presenters or people running big NHS hospitals or head teachers or doctors are paid the right multiple of the lowest paid people in the organisation. How do you begin to kind of approach that with an eye on fairness?
Well, first of all, I think you have to acknowledge that good efforts should be rewarded. What was interesting in the Panorama programme last week was watched by a lot of people. The Chief Constable of Cleveland, who's done a great job in actually lowering the crime rates in Cleveland by dramatic amounts and earns £200,000 a year. The residents of Cleveland didn't say, "Oh my God, he's paid too much." They said, "This man is worth his hire." And so I think and then...
And you could say the same potentially about someone like who's a very successful football player who millions of people go to watch and follow.
But this is the point about proportionality, and why it's important to get this balance between what I call a libertarian view of fairness and an egalitarian view of fairness. Because a footballer can say, or a hedge fund manager, or an investment banker, or as the CEO of a large company, this success of this organisation, this team, this company is all down to me, and it's only fair that I should scoop the pool. I should take everything. That's fair. And if you want to attract people like me, then you've got to pay me the maximum that I could possibly be worth. And then there's other people who say, hold on a minute, a football team is a team, a company is a social organisation. More than a school is more than the headmaster. There's a lot of people who contribute to this good outcome, and that's an egalitarian view of fairness. And what I've tried to do is to fuse these two and to say yes.
So did you come up with a sort of mathematical slide rule principle in the middle which allows that fusion to take place?
Yes. Well, this is the direction of my thinking. That you do accept due deserts for this extra effort, for being what you're worth, but within limits. It should be bounded. And the boundary is, and this was the Prime Minister's idea when he gave me this commission, not mine, that the boundary should be 20-1 in the public sector. And that's got a good pedigree. The Americans at the end of the 19th century, J.P. Morgan, the great bank, was run on a 20-1 ratio right up until the First World War. Drucker, the great kind of management theorist in the States, he also thought that 20-1 was a reasonable ratio. John Lewis Partnership worked on this. It's got a good pedigree.
It would take you back to the kind of multiples that were common in the 1950s and 1960s, I suspect, in all sorts of organisations.
In base pay.
And which have gone away.
In base pay, excluding bonuses, even in the city, as late as the early 1990s, yes. And it's saying, yes, if you're good, you should make a lot of money. If you're productive, it's trying to draw a distinction between productive entrepreneurship, people who really generate wealth in our society. I mentioned, everyone knows about James Dyson. You could also talk about Autonomy, the company that's gone from nothing to something in 15 years, or the Cambridge Science Park, one of the biggest companies in the country. We need more autonomies, more James Dysons, and we need a few less hedge funds and a few less investment bankers.
I'll let Lars defend hedge funds in a second, but
if we don't run our capitalism with some sense of proportionality, of trying to make sure that rewards go to where people have really contributed genuinely effort, and who also accept there should be some boundary to what they get, we get into trouble. And that's one of the reasons we had our financial crisis.
You've already, as it were, jumped the boundary or the border between the public sector and the private sector. Ed Miliband wants has been talking about a high pay commission in the private sector. I can see that if there was a 20-1 proportionality rule in the public sector, that would start to set messages, social messages, which might influence the private sector. But could you do more than influencing the private sector in the mobile world of international capital?
Well, David Cameron and George Osborne, in scope of the review they asked me to do, have asked that exact question. They say, OK, what is the argument for 20-1 in the public sector, and to what extent could that become a social norm and nudge behaviours in the private sector? So I'll be trying to answer that question in the final
which comes
report.
out in November. Or your first
the interim report comes out in November, and the final report comes out in the spring of next year. Yeah, but the private sector is, of course, there's much more risk in the private sector. You might have to adjust the 21 ratio in the public sector. You might have to have some kind of risk premium for what's happening in the private sector, and you've got to kind of try and contextualise even in the public sector what the pay ratio might be. But I don't see why this notion of accepting due desert for discretionary effort, that people are worth their hire, and we all accept it, shouldn't be a reasonable one within boundaries. I don't see why that shouldn't be a reasonable
Ronit Avni wants to come in here.
I'm just curious about how that works in a globalized society now. Is that ratio of 20 to 1 only applicable in a national context, or is it 20 to 1 if you've got companies overseas with an entirely different standard of living and base pay rate?
Well, if we had global governance, one might start talking about this. But I don't see why 20 to 1 shouldn't be a ratio that shouldn't apply across most kind of liberal democracies. Certainly, it came out of the United States originally. If you look at most of the member states of the European Union, and indeed, actually, some of the South Korea or Japan, you'll find that is currently broadly where they're at, or just above it. This wouldn't. I mean, it's really only a few economies, the Americans and some parts of the British economy, where this is such an acute issue.
Lars Kreuer.
Yeah, I have a question between the difference between this productive entrepreneurship and the kind we sort of rent-seeking entrepreneurship. You mentioned in the book a very interesting study that the 10 largest private equity deals returned some 300% from 2005 to 2007, and that only a fifth of that was due to, as you say, the right kind of entrepreneurship. My question really is, to me, that's actually a very, very good number. If you suggest that you're returning, it comes down to some 15% a year return on equity from actual value creation. I mean, I know people in the clean tech sector that would love that. And I actually took that study to say, well, private equity sort of, using those numbers, proved its worth.
Well, don't you in your book say that the one, when you're having to tell your investors what the real rate of return is, and you didn't want to say the word 12, and now you're saying that 15 is great.
Yeah. I'd be very happy to explain that. That has a lot to do with the difference in the risk that you're taking. If you're creating, in fact, the 15% you quote here, which is why I've considered phenomenal, is because it's when you've taken the other factors away, namely the market and debt. You've actually densed it down to just actual value creation. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like if I'd done that, I'd be bigger than George Soros.
Yeah, but I mean, the big
in your
point,
dreams,
but that
in
is
my reality these days.
But that's the residual after the returns from all the leverage. And
this is getting too complicated for most of us,
but to get at the residual, you had to have billions and tens of billions, hundreds of billions of pounds of leverage, which has actually now got to be unwound. And one of the reasons why we got into such trouble in 2008 was all this extraordinary leverage.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We're going to return to English now. Silly Ivory.
No, just that I sort of feel like you need a cool flannel on your head sometimes when we're discussing these kind of things. But I mean, what struck me about the book, which I just think it's such a radical book. I mean, it's an extraordinary book, I think. Well, and its language is very reasonable. But I think what it's suggesting, and fantastically so, is a really, really major rethink of society. And I think that irrespective of what works and what doesn't work, it's just that at a human level, it's going to require such a fundamental shift in the way that we think, and the way that we, particularly in this country. I mean, you talk globally. I mean, this thing about an Englishman's home is his castle, all that kind of sort of ingrained. Let's shut the door and bolt it, and I just wonder how you think that we can. That we can really make those social changes. I mean, I
wonder if it is such a big difficulty that once you get sort of leadership and politicians talking about it, whether ideas don't spread a little bit faster than we.
Well, at the moment we've got. I mean, here I am. I've written this book, and the coalition governors asked me to do this review, which will be informed by some of the thinking in this. And there's the new leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, is talking about a high pay commission, and I don't see how you could do a high pay commission without it being informed by some of these ideas as well. So, once you get the political class talking in this way, you at least have the first building block. Because my view in democracies is that you just have to argue your head off. You have to argue your head off about what you think is right, and keep on arguing. And one of the problems with the Labour Party under Gordon Brown in particular was that it stopped arguing. It just was declaimed. And we may, I think, be entering a very much interesting territory where the coalition government and the Labour opposition start to have an argument about how you do fairness.
That would be very interesting. Well, one of the things that they'll be talking about all the way through this, of course, is the financial sector, the banking sector. And we hear an awful lot about hedge funds. But Lars Kreuer, you created your own hedge fund. And you've written this book, Money Mavericks, Confessions of a Hedge Fund Manager. And it's the sort of human story, which we don't really often hear about, what it's actually like being a hedge fund manager and what it's all about. But before we do that, try and explain to us what a hedge fund is.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, there isn't a really decent definition of a hedge fund. It's actually a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I think that outside the industry, there's this perception that it's easy to define and they all do the same stuff. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. It's generally known to be it's a private partnership. They tend to be managing wealthy individuals and institutional money. The word hedge fund came actually from many, many years ago. There's a guy in the U.S. called Jones who created and marketed a fund called the hedged fund. The idea being that you could somehow hedge your return against certain risks that you didn't want to take. So you could hedge against markets going down. It's since then there's been a tremendous proliferation of hedge funds, and today the term means investing in any kind of asset class and any kind of geography with vastly different gearing levels. So a lot of
it's a financial instrument which can do lots of different things depending on the skills of the people running it.
Correct. I think there's in hedge funds, one of the things the insiders in the industry appreciate the most is that you have using financial tools, the flexibility to express a lot of investment views that you couldn't do just buying the market.
So your fund, explain what the idea was behind your fund.
So my fund was what you'd call a market-neutral special situations fund. Okay, so that sounds complex. If we break it into two, you say special situations. Well, what does that mean? You hardly ever hear of a situation that doesn't think it's special. But it's typically something involving a merger, a restructuring, a complex corporate structure of some sort that you can break down into its constituent parts. The market neutrality means that what we aimed to do was to have the returns that our investors got from investing with us, have those returns in no way be related to movements in the market. So in other words, whether you made or lost money investing in Holte Capital didn't depend on the wider market going up or down.
Right.
Also known as zero correlation. Right?
And at one point,
which I would now know is completely phony. As you
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the issue of correlation is one of those massively overused words, and
it's not going to be overused on this program anymore. Right. One thing that I did strike me, a bit of the book where I really understood or thought I understood what was going on, is where you talk about the different variables that you're juggling with. You can have three variables involving the situation inside a company and currency and the general market position. And then you've got a fourth variable. And it's at that point where a very, very few very, very clever people might be able to hold in their heads information about what's happening and therefore make predictions about the future, but most people can't.
I think this is actually an area where I feel we are able to use finance to make complex things simpler. That if you think of investing, just buying a share in a company, I think an Italian company is the one I use in the book, which you're buying an Italian bank, but you're really buying the Italian market. You're buying certain currency exposures. You're buying an insurance company. You're buying this. You're buying that. And where we, through hedging structures, can actually make that bank into something that is much simpler to understand and much simpler to analyze. So I always find it curious when someone says, you should buy the bank, and you then ask them, well, what do you think of its insurance bit? And they say, I don't really know, that's not what I analyze. Whereas we can actually take that insurance bit and hedge it out.
So you know what you're buying. There's a great.
So it sounds very complex, but the structuring can be, but you're trying to make something complex into something simpler.
There's a great human story here, because I had this idea in my head of hedge fund managers. They go around in vastly expensive cars and they live in this very, very swanky world and they're masters of the universe and it's all great. And actually, when you're getting your hedge fund going, it's not like that at all. You're going to these conferences and no one's speaking to you because you're not big enough yet. It's like anything else.
I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was really that partly to deal with that misperception. There's it sort of seems commonly accepted and understood that all hedge fund managers fly private jets and they are multi-billionaires, and some are, but many, many more are not. Starting a hedge fund was, in a sense, it was more about starting a business, being an entrepreneur, and it was just really, really hard going. And
you don't pay yourself very much, and it's your baby.
I pay myself zero, and I spend most of my savings trying to get it off the ground. And I had this in my spreadsheet that every day I went to work where we weren't raising any money, I would have a day less before I'd have to shut it down. So I was down to 12 months, and at that point I was gonna, it's unfair to say go live in my parents' basement, but I was going to need to go get a job because I was running out of money. So that's, in a sense, just an entrepreneurial story that happened to be in the world of hedge funds.
Exactly. And similarly, once things are going well for your hedge fund and it's buzzing, you get drawn into this extraordinarily accelerated world of if not private jets, at least extraordinary parties, and you're working 19 hours a day and all of that.
Yeah, I don't want to cast myself too much as an outsider because I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I was privileged to have a great education. I worked for a very prestigious fund before I started my own.
Yeah.
But even when we were running a lot of money and doing very, very well, there's still not that world. I mean, I know a lot of hedge fund managers, and most of them wear old jackets and drive old cars. They can afford to probably buy a new fancy car every day if they wanted to, but they don't.
Yeah.
And I certainly think it's a misperception that everyone is like that, because they're really not.
And just before we open this up, there's one story which I thought was incredibly moving, but also sort of everybody's had these times in their life where there's a sort of day where everything goes wrong at once, the great crisis day. It would be in a novel. And in your case, it was with a Norwegian shipyard, very important for your fund, and it was going down the tubes, and you got a call from your girl's nursery to say that you got something in her eye, and you ended up in the hospital.
Yeah, in the Marylebone Eye Hospital. Yeah, what happened was we had one of these mornings where, that's the thing about financial markets, you don't realize that things can come from just nowhere. It's just a regular morning, and by 9 a.m. I'd lost $10 million. That's a lot of money. And just as things, and it was really actually downhill from there. And one of these things in financial markets, you just don't know where the bottom is. And it's just going, and you're sitting there, you don't know what to do, you don't feel prepared, you don't feel you know anything. And in fact, the markets just proved that you don't know what you're doing. Yeah. And at that point, I get a call from I had twin daughters, and I get a call from the nursery that one of them had a piece of metal stuck in her eye, and that I had to take her to the eye hospital. My wife and our nanny had both forgotten their mobile phones. So there I am getting calls left, right, and center, and sort of the market rearing its ugly head, and I just have to bolt and go to the eye hospital. And we're standing in the operation room, and I'm still getting phone calls about this situation, and I'm so a part of this world that I take the calls. So I take the calls as I'm preparing to hold down my daughter to open her eye, and it's a long way from the smooth, slick world of finance that people perceive, but I think it's a lot closer to the reality that. And
that was the moment where you think, "What am I doing in my life up to?"
Yeah, there were a lot of things that went into that, and but clearly I'd been doing it for a long, long time. I'd done very, very well, and I'd probably reached the point where it wasn't fair to my investors for me to keep going, and we weren't doing well.
Yeah,
this was before the crash, so a lot of things played into it, but I think the overall thing is that in Money Mavericks, I wanted to give the human side of it, and so this is why it's so light on finance.
Billy Ivory.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a great read actually, and I mean there were great bits of it I didn't understand. I'll be honest with you, and I don't think I'm the brightest.
Nor me, Billy. I'm with you there.
Tool in the box there, but it was what was interesting for me was that kind of the human side of it, but I still did find myself thinking that although it was very informed gambling, a lot of it did still seem like it was gambling, and that kind of made me maybe a bit nervous. Those huge amounts of money, and I just wondered whether do you just become impervious to sort of the numbers that you're talking because you're doing it all the time?
There is an element that you're staring at your screen and there are numbers flicking. They go red, black, you're making losing money, and it does. It from the outside can easily look like a casino. But you got to keep in mind that you should only be managing other people's money if you believe you can do better than throwing darts. Right? You're charging large fees, and for those large fees, the investors have a right to expect that you're going to do something better. It's not a gambling den, and
and you think the fee structure is excessive?
I think the fee structure is very problematic. I think actually the earlier point on private equity, I think is case in point that what I wanted to illustrate in the book is just there are a lot of people that have money in hedge funds even if they don't know they do. Well, you guys' pension, you might have invested in hedge funds, and
5% of most pensions.
Exactly. That varies. That varies a lot, and it's often through fund to fund. But I think it's just very important for people to acknowledge that. That doesn't mean hedge funds don't make sense. It just means that the hurdle they have to clear to make sense is very high indeed.
We're going to move to the other end of the scale now, and still talking about fairness and money and so on. And we're going to rewind back to 1968, the Ford Dagenham plant. 55,000 men there, 187 women, and it's the era of strikes, and the women go on strike, and it becomes an equal pay strike. Billy, you've made what is actually a kind of very feel-good film about this. I mean, people are going to really enjoy it, and they're going to laugh, and they're going to cry, and all the rest of it. How accurate is it to the events of that particular time and place?
It's pretty true, actually. I mean, certainly the sort of the real politic and what was going on at the time is absolutely as it is in the film. The year before, there'd been, I think, 27,000 strikes just in the motor industry in '67, and it was just chaos. And certainly, there were 15 unions at Ford looking after the workers, and they were getting used to strikes all the time, but they were settled quite quickly. And then, when the women came out, they just didn't behave as the men, and that's what threw everybody, including the union. But certainly, I mean, all of the Barbara Castle, the way she's portrayed, I mean, she's a slightly kind of more rarefied version, perhaps, than the real thing. But you know, everything that she talks about was all the stuff I'd got from her diaries and from interviews with her and stuff like that.
Yes, and at the end of the film, we actually see some of the women who were on strike at the time being interviewed. So they were probably not quite as glamorous as the actresses that you selected or were selected for the film. But
no. I mean, the big thing for me was, I mean, there were people there I could easily have just lifted straight from the factory floor, but because the nature of the movie was that I wanted to kind of dramatise the personal lives a lot, and I felt uncomfortable doing that. I mean, let's just tell you, there was one lady who was well known as effing Eileen on the plant, and I thought, I just can't use that; it would just take it too far for a family film. So I just kind of extrapolated from that, and I got Bleeding Brenda, who was just alliterated slightly differently, but I just took bits and bobs from the people who were.
Yes, and it was and it was obviously a big moment of social change as well, which gives you an awful lot of the context. It's the moment where what we think of the '60s has reached Dagenham.
But I think what was funny about it, Andrew, was that you got the Dagenham itself was. I mean, when the women came up to Parliament as they did to protest, that was a major trip out. And in terms of the swinging '60s, a lot of it hadn't. It was taking a long time to filter through to Dagenham, and we wanted to try and get a sense of that there was all the colour. It was starting to bleed through into that part of East London.
But it's still interesting. We think of the '60s. It's still a time when a lot of the men are in sort of drip dry white shirts and narrow ties and sober suits, and there aren't many loons and.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, I think what was really interesting was that there was a kind of very British way of even the industrial unrest. It was all kind of. I think Ken Cranham, who's in the film, says at one time, the women say, look, why have they sent us this letter? And he said, well, that's what they do. It's like the rules. We've always done strikes like this, and even the unrest is kind of it's all controlled. And then so when the women actually doing that wonderfully sort of British thing of being just saying, I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but then putting their foot down, saying, no, I really don't agree with it. And when the management said, well, perhaps we'll talk about it. You'd like to go back to work, and they said, no, it's a matter of principle. It really did shake everything to its foundations at that point, because it was such a radical thing, but said so easily.
You couldn't have made an upbeat film about strikes in the 1960s unless it was about equal pay, though, could you really?
No, I mean, that's one of the, in terms of a subject for me as a writer, I mean, that was the godsend. Was
because an awful lot of British industry was hammered by strikes and bad industrial relations.
I mean, there's a point in the film where the Ford worker, the Ford management official who's come across, he says to Barbara Castle, he said, look, you've got to hold the line with us here against the unions, or we'll take our cars, we'll take our industry elsewhere. And of course, that is what happened. And there were times working on the film where, also, there's a bit where Barbara Castle's with Wilson, and she's saying, you've got to give me the power to deal with the unions. And Wilson's just he's saying, get Jack Scamp in and let's just get beer and pork pie and it'll all be fine. And again, that they're storing up problems for later. And indeed, 17, Winter Discontent, it did all come to a head then.
Yes. The bit that I thought must be completely fictitious is there's the very posh woman who's the wife of one of the Ford managers and forms a sort of a sisterly solidarity with the leader of the strikers. That can't have happened, can it?
No, I'm afraid
It didn't.
guilty as charged.
I thought it didn't. I thought, but it's very moving. What did the rest of us make of this?
Fantastic film. It's all credit to the BBC and the UK Film Council now defunct for funding it. But you really capture 1968 Britain. But I also thought when I learnt who the four people had been gathered here, I thought, what's the common theme between all of us? And it wasn't obvious to me until I finally saw Badrousse last night, and I thought, my God, this is justice. There's the common theme here is what constitutes justice, what constitutes fairness, and there you are. That what made that strike legitimate and was, in terms of the early discussion I have about equality and fairness, was that actually it is absolutely clear that men and women should get paid the same rate for the same job. And there's just no argument. That's kind of egalitarian fairness working its way out indisputably. And in terms of the strike, there may have been a disproportional amount of strikes in the 1960s, 1970s, but this one was seen by everybody as completely proportional. Absolutely. And you capture a moment in labour history where, a group of workers, 187 machinists, actually do something, fantastic and actually make these institutions kind of live in a way as they should have been lived. I mean, this is actually the point of, organised labour. When it gets itself into this position, you can see it as correcting a manifest injustice. And it's funny and it's inspiring and you capture the mood of the moment. I thought it was glorious.
But did you like it?
Bless you.
I'll second that. I thought one of the things I really liked about it was you managed to create this upbeat film, but you also show us how hard it's been for the women. They have problems at home. There's the prospect of you ruining everyone's livelihood because they're just going to move abroad. So you managed to create an upbeat movie, but you still show us those problems that become very relevant later on. So
Well, we're going to move on to another form of resistance now, one that's going on probably today and certainly last week and before that and next week too, which is the struggle between Palestinian villagers, in this case, in the West Bank, and Israeli settlers. And networking between them is, of course, the security barrier, the Israeli wall. And your film Ronit Evni, is called Budrus, which is the name of the village where you set it. Yes. And the problem with Budrus, like so many villages, is that the Israeli wall is going to come between them and their fields, which they rely on, their olive trees. And that's where it starts. Now, what makes Budrus different from other parts of the West Bank in terms of what happened?
Budrus face something, as you mentioned, that's very common. But what really sets them apart is the strategy that they used in order to save the village. So Ayed Murar, the main protagonist of the film, did something incredible that people speak about in theoretical terms as though it hasn't happened. He united all of the political factions within the village. So Hamas, Fatah, PFLP, Islamic Jihad, they all came together. And they started to demonstrate nonviolently, but without much success. And then his 15-year-old daughter, in typical teenage fashion, one day asks her father, "Where are all the women?" And her father, like a true community organizer, says, well, if you want women to participate, go ahead and organize them. And so the women come to the front lines, and that's when the situation in Budrus starts to change. And they start struggling side by side. Israelis come in, internationals come in. And after a 10-month period, I'm not going to give away the ending, but some remarkable transitions happen as a result of this nonviolent movement. You
were in amongst the villagers and indeed the Israeli Defense Force as well. And there is a remarkable Israeli female soldier who becomes somebody that the villagers sort of target, particularly the women, target and shout at and all the rest of it, and who you get talking back.
Yes, Yasmin Levy was the border police woman stationed in Budrus at the time, and there is this.
She's quite hardcore, isn't she?
She's a very interesting character. People tend to be fascinated by her. At every question and answer session after the film, I'm always asked about her. People want to know if her views have changed, if there's been some shift. But I think that her ambivalence is very characteristic. I mean, I think she looked at her her work as a job. I mean, she looked at being there in Budrus and her conduct as her duty and her responsibility. And yet she saw that, she was there. I'm sure she had thought that she was coming in to defend Israelis from terror. And instead, she's faced with a 15-year-old girl and the women behind her from the village. And a really fascinating dynamic evolves between, the women know her by name, and to this day, they still remember her. I mean, it's quite interesting because we brought the film back to the village to show it to them a few months ago, and all of them, when they saw Yasmin, I mean, the recognition was full on, and lots of responses were elicited.
I was also very struck by one of the things that the Israeli commander in the area said, where you're showing his people going pretty berserk. I mean, they're getting very, very angry and aggressive indeed. And he says, but they're only kids. They're only 18, 19-year-old,
right.
and the testosterone starts to flow. And I thought there was an honesty there. This is, whatever the politics of it, in the end, it's angry people getting overwrought facing each other.
Absolutely. I think the age dynamic is apparent in the movie, that you have 15-year-olds. You have 15-year-old Palestinians throwing stones, and you've got 18-year-old soldiers who are trying to build this barrier through the village. And ultimately, it's not about the youth. Ultimately, this is about the decision makers.
There was one other issue that's not directly addressed in the film, but really struck me when I was watching it, which is demography. Because you've got the different Palestinian families from Fatah and Hamas getting together, and they're all proud they've got 5 or 6 or 7 children. And you're thinking, this is a very small amount of land. There aren't many olive trees there. And maybe part of the problem is that there's just too many people growing in this area who are going to be sustained there.
It's actually a very small village, and there is a lot. I mean, it is still an agricultural village. I think it speaks more to a rural-urban divide than anything else. It's a 1,500-person village, and they have about 3,000 olive trees. So it's not an overpopulated. I mean, we've been there and spent quite a bit of time. It's not overpopulated. I think it does speak to issues of the economy, the economic state, and the fact that it's an agricultural community reliant on big families to be able to harvest olives, and it's quite traditional.
I was I thought Ayad, the kind of leader of the village, is his humanity and his actually understanding. And perhaps I'm so versed in this stuff about fairness and justice and desert now, but at one stage he says, well, Israel does have the right to look after the security of its citizens. But what's wrong with this war is that it's disproportionate. It's utterly disproportionate. It should take our olive trees.
It should be on Israeli land, not on Palestinian
absolutely.
land.
It's utterly disproportionate. And by the way, it's not our due desert that this should happen to us. And these two things, the disproportionality of the action, even while you acknowledge that the Israelis have got some reason for concern about their security, and the kind of undue desert, the complete undeservedness of this happening to his village, are what. And and you see this call for justice as springing up, and I thought it was a really great account of it.
Yeah, one thing I particularly liked about the movie, I don't know if we were supposed to talk about scenes here, but there's the scene where things are getting a bit out of hand, and just how hard it is to keep it nonviolent. And what is nonviolence? Is it, can you throw a stone and still not be called violent? And there's, things are getting out of hand. The main protagonist sort of running around. He's nervous. Someone gets shot. And what I think is the brilliance of it all is that takes us away from this slightly academic, theoretical, what we ought to do, down on the street to what actually happens when you try to do it.
That
and
was
it's
very
just
much
hard.
our intention.
Right? It's just difficult.
That was very much our intention. I mean, we as a team, the 3 producers of the film were Israeli, Palestinian, and Brazilian, and we wanted to show this warts and all. And it does. You're right. It melts down at a certain point, and we want to move away from. There's all this theoretical talk about could Palestinians adopt nonviolence? Could Hamas and Fatah come together? Could women lead? And in the village of Budrus, all of these elements actually emerge. So why don't we speak about it from a place of its practical application on the ground?
I have a question, actually. Early in the movie, you show very well this zigzagging of this border, which seems just crazy. Was there a logic? I know they're going to say security, but what would they say, the Israelis say, was the logic behind this? Just I mean, it looks like a board
All
game.
walls end up designed. I mean, no wall has ever succeeded.
But this,
the
like,
serpentine path,
embodying
the serpentine path definitely raises many questions. The Israeli army spokesperson Doron Spielman talks about security for sure, and Palestinians view it as a land grab. And interestingly, we did interview. He's not in the film. One of the initial proponents of building the barrier in the first place, who ultimately ended up taking. He's a very decorated war veteran, a military veteran in Israel, and he ended up taking the government to court to sue them on the ultimate trajectory. And in his words, an exact quote from the interview is that security was sacrificed on the altar of the settlements. And so it's an open question that in some places it's security, and in some places, it's about land or water, topography, local settlements. We weren't able to get an official explanation from the army. We did ask them as to why this barrier was going to be built through a cemetery, for instance.
Yeah, and of course we should remind people that it's the moratorium on the settlements has ended today. Billy?
Yeah, just one of the things that struck me was just, I think we're all talking about sort of entrenched attitudes, Lars as well, about the way people perceive the financial sector. But what struck me in the film that was so fantastic was to actually see those moments where people are, the school teacher who's the Hamas leader, is that right? Was, when there's one interview with him where he sort of says, I can't ever imagine standing alongside, the opposition effectively and I've just done that, and the look on his face, the
Israelis and Palestinians standing together.
And it's just incredible because you just see, and you suddenly realise, I guess it's what you were saying as well, Will, that you sort of that it's about things happening in action, and then when they do, you kind of go, actually, yeah, this is going to work. This does work, and it's incredible, that moment.
It's definitely, I think, one thing that we were interested in, this idea of pragmatism, that people can be a lot more pragmatic on this issue than we often give them credit for, whether it's the women in the village, whether it's the Israeli activists, whether it's the Hamas members. I do hope that people will go and see it, because I do think that it does shatter a whole variety of stereotypes. It's playing until October 7th at the Empire Leicester Square Theatre.
I was going to read all of that out. You don't need to do that.
Andrew.
Okay. Oh.
So can I say one of the things that struck me about you occasionally go to news footage from the Israeli television. And it's one of the things that in Will's book that I was really, really interested in, which is the whole thing about how attitudes are reinforced by a very sort of static media, or a media that will tell the truth effectively. And I mean, what is the coverage? Is it fair?
The coverage. What was fascinating to us was to see the evolution of coverage. So whereas the Israeli activists joining the Palestinians in Budros were initially called peace marchers, peace demonstrators, over time they become riots. They become, the language shifts.
Changes. Okay, well, we're going to give people an opportunity to see that film, Budros, from Ronit Avni, on at selected cinemas actually around the country, I think, from now. And you can find all the details on the Start of the Week website. Billy Ivory's Made in Dagenham is on general release, as you can see, from almost every bus stop anywhere in Britain from Friday. Will Hutton's Them and Us, Changing Britain, Why We Need a Fair Society, and Lars Kroyer's Money Mavericks, Confessions of a Hedge Fund Manager, are both out, as they say, in all good bookshops now. Next week, we have Jonathan Franzen, whose great American novel, Freedom, has got reviewers on both sides of the Atlantic slavering. Sheila Stevenson on Enlightenment, a play, and the philosopher Barry Smith on how neuroscience is raising more questions than Descartes could ever have dreamed of. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Fairness and struggle today. As the Israeli moratorium on West Bank building ends, we're going to be hearing from the filmmaker Ronit Avni about attempts at peaceful, non-violent resistance by Palestinian villagers and their Jewish allies. But most of today's programme is domestic. As Ed Miliband prepares for his first big speech as Labour leader, lots of talk about the fairness agenda, the prospects for union militancy, and the wickedness of high finance. Well, Billy Ivory's new film, Made in Dagenham, is about the 1968 strike by women workers at the huge Ford plant there, which led, of course, to the equal pay laws. Lars Krøyers, a former hedge fund manager who has written a cracking book about what it's really like inside the industry people love to hate but mostly don't understand. Good looks, or indeed the luck to have wonderful fluency in mathematics or a language. All kinds of luck which can lead you to be a better remunerated, more successful person in life. Should that luck be sort of compensated against? In other words, should you pay a penalty for that kind of luck?
No, you shouldn't pay a penalty for it. It's fair enough that you have got those advantages. And it's particularly fair if you've worked on them to turn yourself into a great athlete or a great mathematician. And we all consider that the rewards that people get for having worked hard on their talents is success. That's fair. That's fair enough. But to a degree, that they should pay into the common pool to help compensate for people who've had in their lives bad luck. In the book, I talk about inheritance tax, where you've done nothing you've just come out, you're just the fruit of your parents' loins, and there you are, a baby. You've done nothing to deserve the money that comes from being born to a very rich family. And rather than call inheritance tax a death tax, I call it we share in your good luck tax.
It's quite a long name, but I get the picture.
And equally, the National Health Service, to a degree, is we share in your bad luck. I mean, people around this tape, people listening to this, they don't know where they're going to draw from the gene pool things that are going to make them extraordinarily ill. And of course, it's a matter of fairness that we should compensate people for that bad luck.
How do you begin to apply these kind of ideas to the dilemmas of the real world? For instance, a great discussion at the moment. You're looking at the public sector as to whether, I suppose, television presenters or people running big NHS hospitals.
If we hold good intentions and there are good outcomes, everyone thinks that we should get our due deserts. If we have bad intentions which produce malevolent outcomes, everyone thinks we should also get our due deserts. In all societies, there's a scales calibrate a tariff of punishment and reward for good and bad things. And fairness tries to capture this. It also is bigger than equality in this important respect. Luck has an enormous effect on all our lives, good and bad luck. It's just there. And if you're thinking hard about fairness, we want to share people's good luck, and we want to compensate them for their bad luck. So there's an egalitarian view of fairness, there's a libertarian view of fairness, but that's the heart of my thinking of fairness.
When it comes to luck in different ways, the luck to be enormously athletic, or the luck to have fantastic at all. We're going to start, though, with a man both the Coalition and Labour have gone to for his ideas about fairness and equality, Will Hutton, whose new book is called Them and Us. At the heart of this book, Will, is the proposition that fairness, rather than the more traditional word equality, should be centred for our thinking about pay and indeed about power. Why fairness rather than equality?
I think fairness is a bigger idea than equality. I mean, equality, of course, within the idea of fairness, you can have egalitarians who consider themselves fair, and you have libertarians who consider themselves to be fair. So, fairness kind of embraces both. The heart of fairness is an idea of proportionality. It's a relationship that we all carry between what we intend and what the outcome is.